Hello, and welcome to Autocracy Now! Today, in our series on Stalin, Episode 10.
Stalin's City.
By July of 1942, Hitler was engaged in another summer offensive driving towards the city of Stalingrad. Again, Stalin had failed to anticipate where the summer offensive would be coming. He was convinced, partially down to Nazi misinformation, that the offensive was going to come in a renewed push to take Moscow. Just as had happened before Operation Barbarossa, Stalin had some genuine warning of what was about to occur when a Luftwaffe plane carrying the invasion plans crashed behind Soviet lines. But just like before, he dismissed this as misinformation. Stalingrad therefore had the benefit of being a surprise target for Hitler. The city had long been a symbolic one for Russians. Before, when it was Tsaritsyn, it had been the site of Stalin's own victories during the Russian Civil War, and it was now the city that bore his name. But beyond mere symbolism, it was also a gateway to the oil fields of the Caucasus, which Hitler needed to capture. He had dramatically claimed that if he did not capture these oil fields, he would have to, quote, liquidate the war. And it's easy to forget that simple resource availability didn't necessarily work out in Hitler's favour. By now he'd conquered Europe and some of North Africa, but both the Nazis and the Japanese during this war were constantly at risk of running out of fuel, with trade supplies from the rest of the world badly limited. Plus, attacking in a region where the Soviets weren't expecting an attack allowed Hitler's preferred strategy of blitzkrieg and vast encirclements to take place. And this was necessary, because even in 1942, the Red Army was already vastly, numerically superior to the invading forces. So, attritional attacks around Moscow would have likely made things worse for Hitler, although of course we'll never know what would have happened if the offensive was somewhere else, and if, for example, an attempt to capture Moscow had been successful. When Stalin eventually realised that this was the genuine offensive for the year, in the summer months while fighting was still possible, he dispatched Marshal Zhukov to the front, and finally recognised his ability by making him Deputy Supreme Commander. The Battle of Stalingrad is often considered one of the decisive turning points in history, perhaps the decisive turning point of the Second World War. On the ground, there was perhaps no sense of the historical nature of what was occurring. After all, there were plenty of meat grinders on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe bombardment and artillery barrages reduced most of the city to rubble, a twisted forest of craters and half-empty buildings. Once again, Stalin refused to let the civilians leave, with an incalculable human cost. Savelyeva was a young girl at the time of Stalingrad, and recalled it to journalists later. She said, quote, "The oil tanks nearby had been hit, and the Volga was a sea of fire." The Volga is the river that Stalingrad lies on. Irregular soldiers had burrowed into the side of the ravine, creating tiny living spaces, each with a front door ripped from a ruined house. She said, "We crouched in the burrow, peeping out. When the incendiary bombs fell, we would rush out and cook potatoes on the flames. When they ran out of potatoes, after that the family had to survive for 3 months by eating lumps of clay from the riverbank." She said, "It was slightly sweet and I would suck on it all day long. My mother collected water from the Volga. There was blood floating downstream. She would crouch down and skim it away with her hand, and then filter the water into a saucepan with a piece of cloth." End quote. It's the kind of life you'd live if you were left in the city of Stalingrad during the war. More bombs were dropped on the city than on London during the height of the Blitz, and then the infantry came. Young female volunteers of the anti-aircraft divisions outside Stalingrad turned their guns on the advancing tanks. The Soviet doctrine of gender equality proved very useful to Stalin during the war, and many women fought in the Red Army or flew bombers. One female sniper, Ludmila Pavlichenko, killed over 300 soldiers. She signed up to join the fight in the 4th year of studying history at Kiev University, and after the war returned to a career as a historian. She also lived in the USA for a time. She delivered speeches encouraging the US to open a second front in the war. She said, quote, "I can't help feeling that the American people are still too indifferent to the war and what it really means. I do not believe the American people as a whole entirely understand what war is like. Most of you so far feel it as an inconvenience, doing without gasoline, being a little limited in the amount of sugar you use. You do not know what it is to have bombs falling all around you. You do not know what it is to see babies murdered, women and girls ravished by the Hitlerite beasts. You do not know what it is to find the charred bodies of your own comrades burned and tortured beyond recognition, to see the rows of brave, fine people you knew, hanging alongside the roadside. You do not know what it is to walk into a home for old people won back from the Germans as I did. It was early morning and the sun was just rising, and we went in to set the people there free. But what we found were the bodies of 108 old people, shot and tortured, slashed to pieces, blown up by grenades. You must learn to hate the enemy as we did. Hatred did not come to us all at once. We are a peace-loving people, and we had to learn to hate. But fierce hatred rose within us when we saw with our own eyes what the Hitler beasts could do. Now we hate the enemy too much to fear him. I have been asked often since I have been here how I feel when I kill a German. The feeling I have after killing a Nazi is the feeling of a hunter who has killed a beast of prey. Every time my bullet fells a Nazi, I have the feeling I have saved lives. Only the dead Nazi can be trusted to leave the innocent unharmed. Every Hitlerite killed is a step forward on the road to the liberation of mankind. The Nazi hunters have often stalked me. One duel with a German sniper lasted 3 days. It was a hunt to the death. If either of us had a suspicion that the other had detected his position, that position was shifted. That was one of the tensest experiences of my life. Finally, he made one move too many. End quote. The female bombers in the Russian military, to get around the problem of their noisy planes, would switch off the engines to dive bomb the German positions without warning. The Germans called them Nachthexen, or night witches, because of their ability to approach without warning. But the women defending the anti-aircraft positions outside Stalingrad were not so lucky. They were overrun, and soon there was fighting in the city streets itself. Dozens of soldiers would be killed in the battle over a single house, a single factory building, a single street. Some 50 Red Army soldiers became trapped in the grain elevator, which would become symbolic of the struggle over the city. When they were asked about the possibility of reinforcements, the response was chilling and typically Stalinist. The Soviet Union thanks you for your sacrifice. It was said that the average lifetime of a soldier coming into the street fighting in Stalingrad was just 24 hours. Helmut Valls was there, managed to survive, and described his experience. He said, quote, "You had bomb craters and grenade craters, and nothing else. So we fought our way to the factory yard of the Red Barricade. Schaubel runs in with his machine gun as if he was on parade ground. He had the machine gun shouldered, and he just keeps running straight. Then he was shot and fell into a grenade crater or a bomb crater. I saw that his mouth was all dirty, and his nose as well. So I wiped that away, and then I said to him, 'Schaubel, you're seriously injured.' And he said, 'Yes, and now I'll be taken back home, now I'll be brought back home.' And that's when I saw he had bullet holes and exit wounds, and bullet holes and exit wounds at the back. And you could see his lungs and blood all around it. Goodness, what am I going to do with this man?' And I said to him, 'Schaubel, just stay where you are. We will fetch you tonight, I promise it to you.' And then I took away his pistol so that he wouldn't shoot himself, and put his canteen next to his mouth so if he was thirsty he was able to drink. He was reported missing later on, I was told that in hospital. Then I went forwards towards the dugout they were shooting from. Bullets were flying above my head, and so I see Russians in front of me, maybe 5 meters away from me. So I called out to them to surrender, and they did not do that, so I threw in a hand grenade, and now you can imagine what it looked like in there. One of them came out and he had blood coming from his mouth, from his nose and from his ears. And he pulled his machine gun, the Russian machine gun with a drum at the front. He pulls it into the air and I say to myself, 'Well, you ain't going to get me.' And I aim my gun at him, and all of a sudden I see little stars. I shot and that was it. I saw little stars in front of my eyes. I looked to my right, and I ran my left hand over my face and a jet of blood comes out, and my teeth flew out of my mouth. It was 10:30 in the morning, a Saturday morning. Now it's all over, I thought, and so my colleague saw it and went, 'Ah! Ah!' He crushed the head of the Russian who had shot me. He crushed his head, despite the steel helmet he was wearing, right into the middle of his face. That made such a cracking noise I can still hear it today. It's brutal, but what can you do?" End quote. I think quite often we wonder about, what is the value of my individual life? What am I worth as a person? And I just think sometimes that there are so many people who had the same questions, the same loves, the same fears, the same hopes, the same dreams, and their eventual fate was just to die fighting over some inch of territory in Stalingrad. You'd go into individual houses and see corpses littering the stairs because there'd been a battle over who could control the top floor of a factory or a family home. The suffering that was caused was just immense. Stalin personally supervised the battle, paying attention to the street-to-street and day-to-day fighting, but he did so from his office in Moscow. Phone calls from Zhukov at the front was the closest he got to the war. He slept for a few hours a night on a metal bed under the stairs in his house, and spent 16 hours a day reading reports from the various fronts. If any of his subordinates missed a single report, they would receive a withering telegram. If you allow yourself to forget your duty, you will be sent to the front. The first successful Soviet counterattack since Moscow was launched with Operation Uranus. One of the commanders in charge was Konstantin Rokossovsky, who we mentioned had his fingernails pulled off by the Nkvd during the Great Terror. This was Rokossovsky's moment of tactical glory. The Soviet armies crashed through the Romanian armies, who were allied with the Nazis at this time, on the flanks, and eventually managed to encircle the German armies that were attacking Stalingrad. When Stalin was told of the success of this operation, he laconically replied, "Carry on." A German counteroffensive to break the encirclement was unsuccessful, and despite Hermann Göring's boasts, the Luftwaffe could not resupply the encircled troops by air. Now it was the turn of a Nazi army to be subjected to the horrendous, inhuman conditions of encirclement. The last few letters written by the encircled soldiers, or at least the ones that survived, are heartbreaking to read, and made it out on the last of the planes to leave that place. The bone fields of Stalingrad are still there, the remnants of this army that was encircled. General Paulus, who had been in charge of the army that was now encircled, was promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler. The implication for this promotion was clear, because no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered or allowed himself to be captured. But Paulus did not commit suicides. As eerie as the fields of ghosts and corpses in the burned-out city, the encircled forces remained in place for weeks, slowly starving to death. Paulus declared, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." After it became clear that he was captured, it put Stalin in a very awkward position. An offer was made for him to exchange his son, Yakov, still languishing in a prisoner of war camp, for the German Field Marshal. As Montefiore points out, Stalin had hoped that his own son would commit suicide, to prevent embarrassment, just as Hitler had hoped the same of Paulus. They were analogous people in a lot of ways. Stalin refused the deal, saying, "Why would I swap a field marshal for a soldier? All of them are my sons." Was this evidence of his callousness towards a son he viewed with suspicion, as just another traitor? In truth, Stalin didn't have that much of a choice, as bad as that sounds to say, and he later sadly lamented, quote, "Just think how many sons ended in camps. Who would swap them for Paulus? Were they worse than Yakov? I had to refuse. What would they have said of me, my millions of party fathers, if I had forgotten about them? I had no choice. Otherwise, I'd no longer be Stalin." End quote. I think it's an interesting insight, because at the beginning of that quote, he's saying, "I can't do this because of my compassion for the other soldiers and the other families who've been affected by the war." But then at the end he does bring it back to himself and his own image in terms of the public perception, and in some ways you question which of those factors was more important in his decision. In another rare instance when his guard fell, he pushed aside his dinner. He said, quote, "Yakov will prefer death to betrayal of the motherland. What a terrible war! How many lives of our people have been taken away? We'll have few families without relatives who have perished." End quote. Not that this moment of compassion made him feel any guilt over ordering civilians to stay in war zones like Leningrad and Stalingrad when they might have been saved, or armies to retreat or surrender when they might have survived. It is worth noting two things before we absolve Stalin and congratulate him on his humanity towards his own son. The first thing is to note that his image and status as Stalin, as Vozhd, as leader, was more important to him than his family members. The second thing to note is that Yakov died a few weeks after the victory of Stalingrad. Some accounts say he was electrocuted in what was either an attempt at suicide or escape, while other files say that he was shot by a guard for disobeying orders. It's very difficult to know which of these is true and which is an Nkvd fabrication, so I'm not sure we'll ever really know. The most dramatic account, which I can't find a good source for, says that Yakov discovered the Nkvd's Scattin massacre in Poland, which the occupying Germans had used as propaganda, and having befriended Polish inmates, committed suicide out of guilt and shame. Whatever the reason, whether he died by suicide or defiance, it rehabilitated him in Stalin's mind. Now that his son had died for the cause, he finally felt that he could be proud with him. The same son that he had mocked after a teenage suicide attempt was now, in Stalin's mind, quote, "a noble man right to the end." Dead people can't betray or disappoint you. This kind of attitude shows how far from normal humanity Stalin had deviated in the years of personal tragedy, absolute power, and mass murder he had endured since the 1920s. His closest relationships were with dead people. Yet many people said that Yakov and Nadia forever troubled him in private. The absence of Stalin's personal life in the light of these personal tragedies makes sense. If he had found any emotions at all in thinking about his family, they must surely be pain and guilt rather than any happiness or comfort. There is a certain impression I get from reading the things that Stalin says about his family, which is very interesting. When he talks about his regrets in dealing with Nadia or Yakov or Vasily, or even Svetlana, he never talks about it in terms of improving, but almost just, the world is set up this way, that I can't relate to these people, that I can't feel empathy for them, that they won't feel empathy for me. He never feels like he has the ability to atone for the things he's done or improve as a person. It's almost as if he's more confused than angry with people. He doesn't understand why they don't love him, and he doesn't understand why there's this barrier between him and others. And in response, he just sort of sadly retreats into his own political life and his own reputation, and almost as if he's accepted being Stalin, the figure, the historical figure, the mass murderer, the tyrant, and not Stalin the man by this stage in his life. Meanwhile, Vasily had been psychologically destroyed by the tormenting presence of his father and his own character flaws. He was permanently drunk, forbidden from any real responsibility in his role as air marshal, but also hopelessly over-promoted. He indulged in classic Commodus-style debauchery. His Red Army issue revolver was mainly used for shooting at tin cans and chandeliers. In daredevil desperation, and instead of actual combat, he would fly planes drunk. As with all these tales of extravagant debauchery, you get the sense that the person in the centre of that whirlwind of drink, sex, and wild antics is desperately trying to bury their subconscious demons, and there's a self-destructive undertone to the things he did. Drinking antifreeze instead of using it on the wings of his plane, he spiralled deeper and deeper into the alcoholism that would eventually lead to his death, aged just 40. It was around this time that Svetlana Stalin, growing into a young woman, began to defy her father. In reading about Stalin, the only person he consistently showed affection for was Svetlana. It was the closest the Stalins got to a functioning family relationship. As a little girl, she'd write to him, "I order you to take me to the theatre," to which Stalin would reply, "All right, I obey." There are plenty of photos of Stalin behaving affectionately towards her, and everyone who surrounded Stalin described her as his clear favourite. But as she grew older, she must have surely become more aware of the unique, bizarre set of circumstances that she lived in, and the rarefied air that she breathed as the daughter of the most powerful man in the country. Adolescence is typically a time, it was for me, probably for you as well, when you become somewhat disillusioned with the world around you. The rules of the world, the unfairnesses, the injustices, which you're shielded from as a child, become apparent. The grim realities of what human beings can do to each other lead to teenage angst, existential crises, and acts of teenage rebellion. I cannot imagine how much this must have been amplified in the case of Svetlana. Aged 16, she discovered, from a tutor who risked her life in disclosing the information, that her mother committed suicide. Her father had ordered the deaths of men she knew, who they weren't allowed to speak about, and now ran a war of unimaginable brutality. Her brother had been taken captive. Her other sibling was an alcoholic playboy who was terrified of her father. One of her closest friends and confidant was Beria's son. Beria's son could truly understand what it was like to have those feelings about your parents. Svetlana, like any of us, had no choice about the circumstances of her birth. It's difficult to imagine the strain that she was put under in this position. Her relationship with her father would be severely frayed by her first proper boyfriend, the film writer Alexei Kapler. He was more than twice her age, she was just 16. Kapler was sweet and affectionate towards Svetlana, but he was also hardly beyond boasting about the status of his new girlfriend. Stalin, who of course knew everything, didn't have him immediately shot, but instead posted him to the front as a war correspondent near Stalingrad. Amazingly, in spite of the Great Terror, and perhaps illustrating that Kapler's affection was somewhat genuine, this didn't deter him, and they continued to see each other when he returned. Stalin, in response, exploded. Imagine the nature of a controlling father with the entire spying apparatus of the Nkvd at his beck and call, who's used to making people that he doesn't like disappear. "I know everything, all your telephone conversations, here they are," he yelled, tapping his pocket, full of the recorded conversations that some poor Nkvd agent had to type up for him. "Your Kapler is an English spy, he's been arrested." When Svetlana tried to defend herself, proclaiming that they were in love, Stalin mocked her, repeating her words back, according to Svetlana's memoirs, with hatred of the very word love. He slapped her face. "Take a look at yourself. Who'd want you?" He then read their love letters. Kapler was sentenced to 5 years. In truth, as you're probably thinking, he was lucky not to be shot, and even managed to survive the war. Svetlana would later say that her father had overreacted. His actions weren't untypical for fathers at that time, and, unfortunately, probably the same tawdry scene plays out in countless different places today when girls start dating and their fathers disapprove. But history does not permit Stalin a single relationship untainted by his paranoia and lack of empathy. At the front, the defeat of Paulus was a crushing blow for the German forces. Their big, strategic summer offensive had failed in its main objective, and soon winter arrived again, rendering additional offensive operations impossible. Every day that passed, more Red Army soldiers were massing on the fronts, and their industrial production was outstripping the Nazis. After Stalingrad, with a few notable exceptions, it was defeat for the Wehrmacht. Stalin was immensely pleased with the victory, and wore the Field Marshal uniform for all of his public appearances after the victory at Stalingrad. This military honour reflected Stalin's enhanced sense of pride, but, probably to the deep relief of Marshal Zhukov and others in high command, Stalin did not now believe himself to be an infallible military genius. When the Nazi forces reorganised after the defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler looked to another great summer offensive. He could not, would not sue for peace, but every delay made it more likely that the Soviets would build up numerical superiority. Stalin, bombastic as ever in victory, was keen on a massive Red Army summer offensive, but Zhukov dissuaded him. He had correctly anticipated where the next offensive would come. Stalin for once trusted his generals and his spy network that told him that forces were concentrated around the Kursk salient. It made strategic sense for Hitler to attack here. It was a bulge of Soviet territory into the Nazi-occupied region, and the plan was to cut this bulge off and trap forces in another massive encirclement. Stalin, keen on the counterattack, wanted to concentrate offensive forces in this region and attempt to encircle the Wehrmacht, but Zhukov warned that this would be playing into the German hands. Listening to his general, they instead pursued a strategy of defence in depth, layer upon layer of mines, anti-tank guns and artillery where they knew the attack would come. This time, the Blitzkrieg tactics encountered 190 miles of defences and massive reserves of Soviet tanks. In the largest armoured engagement in history, over the space of a month, the two armies smashed into each other. Soviet losses were immense and far outstripped the Germans in terms of the number of men and tanks. They lost 5 times as many tanks by some estimates. But the Germans also suffered heavy losses and failed to win the battle, achieving none of their objectives. The Nazis simply didn't have the men to lose. The Battle of Kursk was Hitler's last great offensive on the Eastern Front, and his last chance to win the war, and, despite the immense sacrifice of the Red Army, he had failed. From this point on, the Nazi armies were incapable of taking the initiative, and simply had to react to the Red Army's advance. The bloody meat grinder of the Eastern Front would continue for another 2 years, with unimaginable suffering on both sides, as things got more and more desperate. But it was clear, from the day of Kursk onwards, that there would be no decisive victory for the Nazis. Around the same time, the Western Allies were opening up new fronts against the German army, with the invasion of Italy. Rommel was being driven out of North Africa. Preparations were beginning for the D-Day invasion of France, and we'll talk a bit more later on about Stalin negotiating with the other powers in the alliance. As important as these operations were, and they did divert a great deal of German military might from the Eastern Front, the attritional grind and dramatic battles of the Eastern Front were the decisive factors in the Second World War. Before Britain and America take too much credit for defeating the Nazis, we do well to remember that when the D-Day landings happened, there were 58 Nazi divisions in France and Italy. There were 228 in the Soviet Union and on the Eastern Front. The entire Western theatre of the war saw fewer casualties than Stalingrad alone. At unimaginable human cost, and in many ways despite his inept military interventions and his terror policies, Stalin and the Red Army were going to be victorious. During the war, as we have discussed, political repression continued, especially against anyone who was considered a deserter or a defeatist. But in other ways, Stalin relaxed his policies in order to win the war, specifically when it came to culture and the economy. The national anthem of the Soviet Union had been changed to the Internationale, that hymn to the international workers' revolution. Stalin had it replaced with a more patriotic song about the motherland and Russia, albeit one that contained the lines, "Stalin brought us up, inspired us to loyalty towards the people, towards labour and heroic feats." He also critically relaxed persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church, realising that in wartime people would need the comfort of religion. It's also the case that practically every army in history has had some element of propaganda that God was on their side. It kind of reminds me of a quote I saw from a British soldier in World War I. "God must think us all a right bunch of fools. He can't be on both sides." Even in the census taken at the height of the terror, 55% of people willingly declared themselves religious, risking persecution. Surely even more than that lied about their faith. In spite of everything, all the propaganda, all the persecutions, Stalin, the ex-choir boy, the ex-trainee priest, who'd rejected religion, was not able to mould the minds of his people. The one thing they can never take away from you is the cubic inches inside your skull. Around the time of Kursk, he met with the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, effectively the key church leader, the equivalent of the Orthodox Pope, although I won't say that directly because otherwise I'll get letters. He jovially asked why the Patriarch hadn't brought more priests with him. You get the sense he was pretending that the massive arrests and executions just didn't happen. In their negotiations, Stalin allowed religious buildings to reopen for worship purposes, and he stopped persecution of the church. The church, in return, as the state religion had done in the days of the Tsars, supported the wars and helped to prop up the regime's morality. The appeals to patriotism and to religion, instead of Marxist-Leninist ideology and the glory of communism in the party, are clear, pragmatic indications of Stalin's concessions to reality. But as we see so many times with Stalin, his pragmatism never indicates a change of heart, never a real shift in policy. He makes concessions only where he can see that he has no choice, that it strengthens his own position to do so, and always with an eye to increase control. The Orthodox Church that he encouraged was very supportive of the regime, and closely monitored. Free enterprise was tolerated, but the government was still requisitioning resources for the military. In the same way as the workers in the factories and fields were allowed just enough food for them to survive, with the rest going to the army, he perhaps allowed people just enough spiritual succour and patriotism to survive, before snatching it back after the war. And, as the Lend-Lease programme from the Americans meant that high-quality jeeps and other vehicles were being used by the Soviet military, Stalin made it a crime to complement the works of the capitalist bourgeoisie. He might have been allied with liberal Western democracies, and next episode we'll talk about the meetings with Roosevelt and Churchill, but he was never going to allow his society to resemble them, nor concede that they might be superior in any way. If he needed to appear more liberal than he was, to allow the Allies to rehabilitate him as, quote, Uncle Joe, it was a necessary evil. And it worked too. Time magazine named him Person of the Year in 1942. If anyone in particular needs any indication that being named Person of the Year by Time magazine does not necessarily make you a decent person, there you have it. They described how Stalin drank his vodka straight and talked the same way. Only Stalin knew how close Russia stood to defeat in 1942, and how fully he brought Russia through. It is incredibly difficult to get a grasp on Stalin's personality, because he was capable of being so many things to so many people. It would be easy for me to portray him as any one of a number of caricatures. Was he a charming manipulator who knew how to use force to get his own way when necessary, playing off his subordinates against each other? Was he a bloodthirsty tyrant concerned with nothing more than personal power? A paranoid, red Tsar, armed with modern methods of repression? Was he a Marxist ideologue, like Lenin, determined that he was constructing a better world, and that only by destroying every possible saboteur could he create that world? Was he an insane killer and sadist, whose capricious, cruel, oscillating moods, intense and unjustified self-confidence, and mad conspiracy theories wrecked the lives of millions? Was he a man so damaged by personal tragedy that he was incapable of feeling empathy for anyone? Did he have a fanatical sense of his own destiny? Was he concerned with leaving a great legacy? A control freak, an egomaniac, an empire builder? Did he buy into the cult of personality that he invented around himself? All of these characterizations have aspects that fit, and then aspects that don't. He relished the role of the wise, cunning statesman and diplomat that the Western media gave him during the alliance, even though his Marxism meant that he should have nothing but contempt for the capitalist nations. No single portrayal seems to fit, and so we have no choice but to throw up our hands and say what people least like to say when they're trying to construct a narrative out of the bizarreness of life. It's complicated. Through any war, but particularly in the case of the Great Patriotic War, as it came to be known in Russia, we need to be aware of a dramatic disconnect. When the Bolsheviks ran the state like a military, albeit a chaotic, neurotic one at times, they invited the same disconnect. People sit in offices, look at maps, and consider that an offensive in such and such a sector would be strategically useful, or dictate that such and such a line must be held at any cost. And on the ground, in reality, people die en masse. Single orders dictated by Stalin, the not one step back order, the order that referred to anyone taken prisoner as a malicious deserter. The consequences of these diktats on the ground were, more often than not, mass executions. Not just of soldiers and prisoners of war, but of innocents too. There were terrible atrocities committed on both sides during the war, such as accounts of prisoners being executed by being hosed down in the Russian winter, so as not to waste bullets on them. As the fighting grew more and more bitter, the violence escalated. But as we know, one death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths? I cannot begin to understand the suffering caused by Hitler and Stalin during the Second World War. If you go down the trends and forces approach to history, and argue that war was inevitable without these two dictators at the helm of vast armies, you may well be right. But you can't deny the specific ideologies and idiosyncrasies of these men made the war far bloodier and more brutal than it would otherwise have been. Again, I feel the sense that there's nothing good that can come of this knowledge unless we all remember the possible consequences of dehumanizing other people. But I don't feel like there can be any explanation, any rationalization. Every life is a perspective as infinite and complex as your own, a world unto itself. To see it become so cheap, there's nothing there but a vast sadness. In the best of all possible worlds, these things would never have happened. But that's not where we live. Thank you for listening to Autocracy Now. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can do all the usual things that help support the show. Email us, Twitter, Facebook. You can donate to the show, visit the website. Next time, we'll talk about the end to the war, and then loop back around to discuss the diplomacy that Stalin was undertaking. In the Big Three conferences with Roosevelt and Churchill, they negotiated the carve-up of the whole world. Until then, what else is there to say? Be kind to each other.